So I'm going to talk a bit about today the work we've been doing in enterprising science, now ongoing conceptual struggle to try and understand or think about this idea, work with this idea of science capital. So obviously we're coming from the basis of Bourdieu not having looked much at scientific and technical forms of capital and having focused on high culture. We're interested in capital as the process of legitimation of capital rather than just capital as a thing in and of itself. And as was previously set out in the preceding session, we're interested in the idea that scientific and technical forms of capital now have particular forms of exchange value in society. And our work is also situated against the so-called crisis in STEM participation, which is a prominent policy discourse, this idea that we need to get more people into science, and how do we do that? And I think, as was set out before, that there's a rise of scientific forms of cultural forms in the popular media as well. There's the sort of edutainment of Brian Cox and people like that. So Bourdieu, as I said before, doesn't completely ignore the idea of scientific or technical forms of capital. He does talk about technical capital in some of his work, and he does even talk about scientific forms of capital, but he very much does so in terms of scientific authority, the sorts of authority that might rest within scientists. But I think it's fair to say they're relatively undeveloped concepts conceptually and empirically, so this is what we're trying to work with in our research. So we're interested in science capital because of the work we did previously in the Aspires project, looking at kids' science and career aspirations from 10 to 14. And in that project, we started to use the idea of science capital basically as a kind of shorthand for referring to any science-related resources that we thought children or families might have. When we were looking at our data, we found that the amount of science-related resources they had in their home life seemed to correlate very strongly with the likelihood of a child wanting to study science post-16 and or have an aspiration to pursue a scientific career. So we thought it was interesting, and in the Enterprising Science project, we're just trying to work that up a bit more conceptually, empirically and methodologically. This is a very unhelpful, very complicated diagram that is perhaps very unwise of me to attempt with my limited PowerPoint skills, but it's basically just saying these are the sorts of things we see as interrelating, relating to each other, so that capitals as relating to habitus as the value of them is determined by the field, and that they maybe affect these sorts of dispositions and outcomes. So we've been trying to develop this initial conceptual model of science capital. So what might it contain? So it's trying to be a little bit more disciplined with our thinking. So we thought, well, obviously there are elements of cultural capital within it. So we think there may be ideas of scientific literacy, science-related dispositions. So this is sort of, Bourdieu talks about it in terms of appreciating particular sorts of art, but we're saying, well, is there a valuing of science in society type equivalent? The symbolic science-related knowledge that people might have, their consumption of science-related media, different practices that may engage in participation in extracurricular science-related practices, like whether they go to museums, whether they do experiments at home, go on nature walks. So all of these sorts of forms of cultural capital we think might be important within a notion of science capital. But we think science capital isn't just these. We think there can also be social capital aspects of it as well. So we're interested in this idea of, well, if you know people who work in science-related jobs, that seems to be important as well. Is that a way of getting that cultural capital through social capital? So we think it may, whether your parents have science qualifications is important, how many people you may talk to about science in your everyday life, and whether you see yourself as scientific and or seen by other people as scientific. So this is drawing on work like people like Angie have done and Heidi Carlone in the States. So the idea of the science identity and being recognised as scientific. So those are the sorts of elements that we've put into it. The reason that parental science qualifications is in square brackets is because although we've tried over lots of different projects and surveys to get younger kids to tell us whether their parents have science qualifications, we found that in practice that's been incredibly difficult to actually get them to even understand, let alone answer the question in any sort of reliable way. So we've started to try and develop this a kind of questionnaire element. So it's not the whole of our project. Our project very much uses mixed methods. We're interested in the qualitative as well. But I'm just going to focus on what we see as the trickier task of trying to say, well, how could we measure science capital if that's a reasonable thing to be doing? So we've drawn on a mixture of original and pre-existing instruments, so our own, obviously Bourdieu, various things like the Public Attitudes to Science Survey. And we've so far to date gone through various rounds of piloting. So as you can see, last summer, 1,400 students, 6,000 last autumn. But both of those samples, those first two, are with the schools that we're working with within the Enterprising Science project. And because that project is focused specifically on young people from underserved communities of disadvantaged backgrounds, we've got schools we're working with, and we've got a set of comparison schools that are matched to those schools which aren't doing the interventions, but of course they're not nationally representative because they tend to be representing less advantaged social backgrounds. So this spring, summer at the bottom there, we've also done a top-up, a nationally representative survey to help contextualise those other ones. So we put in all the elements that I listed out, the different forms of cultural and social capital that we think might be relevant for science capital. And we went through and assigned weightings to the variables, as you can imagine, based on our readings of the literature and a bit of putting your finger in the air to a certain extent. And this generated a set of scores for students on a scale which we converted. And there's just a little picture there of the sort of distribution of responses that we got. And this is from the nationally representative sample. So we tried to map out, well, what might, if you're up the top end of the scale with so-called higher science capital versus if you're at a lower end, what might those look like in practice? So these are just some trying to flesh out, well, if you're scoring higher on these items, what might it look like? So if you've got higher science capital, you've got higher levels of scientific, you're getting higher scores for scientific literacy, your understanding of scientific ideas, concepts, how science works. You're likely to be more confident in your scientific skills, recognised by others as being a science person. You've got family, friends, but particularly parents who work in science-related jobs, and you tend to take part in a lot of science-related activities out of school. Of course, at the other end of the scale, the opposite, so you've got lower scientific literacy, less confident, limited social contacts, and limited participation in out-of-school activities. So when we looked at the data, we found that, reassuringly, I think science capital obviously aligns very closely with cultural capital, so I think we're seeing it as a subset or a form of cultural capital rather than something specific, different in its own right. And obviously, the higher levels of cultural capital you have, the more likely you are to have higher levels of science capital. So just on a little graph there's the relationship between cultural capital and science capital. So basically, you tend to score higher on science capital the more cultural capital you have. So we then looked across our sample and said, well, how did it spread out? So obviously, where you put the boundary points for what you're calling high, medium and low is provisional, and you can go through, you don't just do it and assume that's it. So this is the current version that we're working with, where we put our boundaries in terms of what we're defining as high, medium, low. It turns out that we had 7% of this sample as having high science capital. The majority were falling in the middle, as the graph showed, and 20% at the bottom were having low science capital. And obviously you have to put brackets around these figures, but I think we would still suggest that it's that 20% of low science capital is quite problematic in social justice terms, and we feel warrants putting attention into. As you can imagine, when we looked at whose scores related to which background variables, there was a strong patterning of science capital, as you would expect with cultural capital. We found that boys were scoring significantly higher than girls. So I think coming back to the question posed earlier around gender and how the similar amounts of capital may or may not be valued differently in different bodies. Ethnicity, so our Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian scored higher than white and black students. Cultural capital, as I said before, higher cultural capital relates to higher science capital. Our students in the high sets at school were scoring the highest science capital. And those who had future plans, who are planning, either had aspirations to study science in the future or to pursue a scientific career, were scoring higher science capital. So we just produced a few little pen portraits to give a sense of what these levels were looking like. So the 7.3% of students who we classified as having high science capital as that patterning suggests, they're more likely to be male, from Asian or Middle Eastern backgrounds. They're most likely to come from socially advantaged homes. They're in the top set for science. They want to do science in the future. And they're more interested in studying it at higher levels than all of the other groups. So our medium science capital students, so these were the majority. And in terms of gender, ethnicity, social class, they pretty much reflected the majority, the overall proportions of our sample. They're less interested in doing science in the future than those with high science capital, but more interested than those with low. And they're, as you see, 20% of them are interested in studying at university, 28% at A-level, so they don't quite want to continue with it as much as the other groupings. And our low science capital students are more likely to be girls and to come from less socially advantaged backgrounds in the bottom sets, and so on. And they're much more likely to want to drop science than the other groups. So we also saw a relationship between science capital and science aspirations. So aspirations are things that we were interested in already, in terms of them being potentially socially indicative phenomena. Not that we expect that the aspiration you express when you're at school at this age is what's going to happen in the future, but we know that they can give a good general sense of the sorts of things you're likely to end up in the future. So as you can see from this item, the percentage of students agreeing, I want to study a science subject at university, seems to be quite strongly inflected by the amount of capital, science capital that you have. So our next steps are, we're going to continue, well, I say we, Jen, who's at the back, is really the person who does the multi-level modelling, going to continue to explore the relationships between the different variables and the effect sizes. So, for example, already we found that in terms of what kids want to aspire to do in the future, there's a medium effect size for self-efficacy. So we have all these patterns, but then when you put it into the model, the variable that has the strongest relationship seems to be self-efficacy. So there are lots of things in there that we want to explore more. And there's also some interesting things that have been coming out when we've been analysing this data and the previous pilot data. So, for example, the relationship between whether students see science as relevant to their everyday life is strongly patterned, but it has the strongest relationship to their views of their science teachers. So we're going to look for things within these analyses which might give us ideas for what we can work on productively in the implementation side of the project. So we know we can't go out and give all of these students, parents, A-levels and degrees in science subjects to raise their science capital in that way, but there might be hints within the analyses of where it's useful to put emphasis if we want to try and be more socially transformative. And likewise, there's an interesting relationship between the amount of after-school activities you do and the amount of in-school activities, science-related activities that you do. So we're going to reconsider the dividing points for low, medium and high levels of science capital. We'll look at which sorts of variables may predict you falling into different groups. And we're going to try and refine our model a bit more accurately and look again at the weighting. So we'd very much welcome insights and discussion around that. And very much this is an ongoing project. We're going to keep doing these surveys every year, so it's a process of iteration. So this is just the starting point which we're looking for input on. So just to conclude, I think we're suggesting that we see a value in including scientific and technical forms of capital within our wider notions of cultural capital. And we think that the alignment between science capital and cultural capital in general is important and is part of this reproduction of privilege in contemporary society. As I've said, it's ongoing work. And we're interested not just in it, we are interested in this as a conceptual project, but also in terms of what we can actually do with it on the ground. How can we do things that will make a difference for the young people and their families that we're working with? And as I said, we're particularly interested in trying to pick out, well, are there aspects that are more amenable to change? Bourdieu is often described as being very deterministic, and you know, the idea that it's quite difficult to be transformative and to create change. So we're going to try and look in some detail of where are the spaces of possibility within this, and obviously we're trying to find. We're wondering if this is a tool that may be useful to other STEM organisations, so people who work in the field who are out there every day trying to do good things to increase scientific literacy, engage kids and families with science. So could this be a useful tool for them to think about, well, what do we do? Do we know what we're trying to actually change and achieve? And will we know if we're effective if we do it? and just a few photos at the end to remind us that we're not just doing a questionnaire, but we're actually working with very exciting and interesting young people in schools in London and beyond. So I should stop there.